Hello, 499 T-Saw. I know you're all excited about this video. I sent you stuff from this book called Myths and Realities in ESL. And I just wanted to, before we get in the sheltered book, I keep peppering you with a lot of little tidbits. Actually, they're very important things. And these myths, which I don't really like the word myth because it's a complete false belief, is what it is. The enrollment myths, I'm going to go through those quickly. You don't have to study this as a legal document. You just have to know what is what and what is legal or what is to be practiced. And first of all, schools do have to enroll students. They cannot inquire on their legal status in the country, and they can't charge them because they're here without documentation. Schools are neutral when it comes to the origins of the students that go into the school system. I think they can probably ask for them to have vaccinations and to follow the rules of the school, but they cannot deny access to education. And so there's three of those right here, and they give a little scenario, which is cute. But the question is, if you face a situation like this, and what I'm really saying in this video is you are an advocate for your students. You're not a bystander. You don't just observe and say, hey, I don't want to get involved. And especially if you're a TESOL, you're an ESL teacher, you have to get involved. Now, you may not want to do it officially. You may tip people off. You may say, call this number, or you know, you can get either the ACLU, or you can get the Justice Department, et cetera, because I've seen people do things. And I'll give you an example. I know for a fact that a student came back to school after the Christmas break, and it was a practice, and still can be, that some students don't get back to school right after Christmas. They actually go to another country, probably close, you know, like Mexico, Central America, and visit, and then they come back late. And the principal refused to let them enroll. Said they can come back next year. I found out that nothing was done about it. I wasn't at school at the time, but that was completely illegal. You cannot tell students that you're kicking them out of school because of truancy. But because the students didn't know any better, and because nobody else stood up for them at the time, and maybe they didn't want to go to school, they just left. So their school was terminated. The person's argument was they missed too much, they might as well just go away. But the fact is, you can't do that whether it's an 18-year-old or a 16-year-old or a 5-year-old. So you may run into people like that, and if you do, they are violating the law. And you do have to notify somebody so that someone else will take charge. You don't have to go and confront your boss, the principal, if he's your boss, or superintendent, or the school board. Just make it known what's going on and get that information out. We are not running a police state here. You can tip people off when illegal things are going on. Chapter 3 deals with native language instruction myths. And I like this one. These are kind of more interesting and not as obvious. Teachers in the English medium classrooms should not allow students to use their native language, as this will retard their English language development. Wrong. Using your native language, not only do you have a right to use your native language, but you need to use it sometimes to construct meaning when you engage in something you don't know. What else do you have to use if you can't go back to your first language? And you say, well, you have to have thoughts, but you can't speak any of them out loud or ask questions in your native language. So any attempt, and I can't convey this to you strongly enough, any email or overt letter home telling students that not to use Spanish or not to use Arabic or whatever in school to literally prohibit them from using their language is going to get you in so much trouble you don't even want to know. I can guarantee it. A teacher at, I think it's at Duke, but just the other day told the Chinese students in graduate school or undergraduate, said that when they're in the lounge in the building, they shouldn't be speaking Chinese, and actually sent an email out warning them against that. And that person lost their position. They didn't get fired, but they're no longer in charge of what they were in charge of. And any attempt to suppress or to put a stop to another language is going to get you in trouble very quickly. And particularly if you do an email. And I'm surprised somebody at the university level is stupid enough to send such an email. It shows they haven't been out paying attention to what goes on in the world, and they take themselves way too seriously. Bilingual education is a luxury we cannot afford. You may not know this, some of you may. There is a dual language program over at Lexington. Essentially, it could be called a bilingual program. They call it dual language because they don't want to use the word bilingual, because bilingual gets people get sensitive about that. But the fact is that dual language programs or bilingual, these are extremely helpful because they reinforce the understanding concepts. If you're teaching 5th grade math and you're teaching about geometry and you teach it both in Spanish and in English, not only will, hopefully if you have a mixture of kids from different language backgrounds, kids will be able to use Spanish or English, and they'll understand. And being bilingual is money in the bank. I don't know how else to tell you this, but it's like having a magic power, because most Americans don't realize how, well, a lot of them really do in the business world. They know if you're bilingual, you're really going to be useful in your job, because you can deal with a lot more situations. And if you speak 3 languages, even better. Depends on where you live in the country, obviously. But if you speak Korean and English and you live in California, very valuable. Same with Japanese out there, Chinese, and of course Spanish in most places. French is useful in Maine because there are a lot of French-speaking people that cross over from Canada into Maine. And so being bilingual is useful. But there's a real fear about bilingualism. There are actually people that believe that learning 2 languages growing up somehow slows down your mental process, which is just nonsense. Okay, another in chapter, page 14, whatever. When ESL, I call them LEP students, or EL students. By the way, it's changed now. You don't say LEP, limited English proficiency. You say English learners, period. When English learners speak in their native language in English medium classes, medium, I think this is a Canadian book, so that's why they have the word medium. That means in regular classes, they are likely to be off task. No, speaking in another language doesn't mean you're off task. It just means the teacher doesn't know what you're saying, so they're suspicious and they're paranoid and they're afraid you're off task. You can actually be trying to understand the whole thing very thoroughly and using your language to try to understand or ask someone else in the first language what's going on. All you have to do is imagine you're in France trying to learn French, and if you don't understand something, you'll use English, because if you're starting out or very limited, you're going to use what you got. Always be aware of people paranoid about another language being used. I've already covered that in the last 2 myths or misconceptions. Myths about acquiring a second language. These are numerous. I'm just going to give you the ones here, but I may add a couple of others. Learning a second language is an entirely different proposition from learning one's native language. Actually, it's not true. There are many parallels. You learn the second language. Hopefully, you'll learn it first as listening and speaking, but sometimes second languages are taught as reading and writing. But that's the unfortunate situation for a lot of people that studied a second language in high school in the United States, is that you were taught Spanish or French or whatever, and it all was grammar and writing and making lists of words and memorizing how to spell them, but not being able to speak them. So I would add to this that in teaching English as second language, and you essentially, if you're an ESL, you're a foreign language teacher, only the foreign language is English, and it's not foreign to you, but it is to your students, that you want to have listening and speaking as a part of every lesson. It's all not writing down. If you think about your worst Spanish class in high school and do the opposite, within reason what the opposite is. First languages are usually learned at home. Second language are often learned in secondary school, high school, but they don't have to be. First languages are learned with family. Second languages are generally learned with teachers, people that don't love you as much. I'll just put it that way. First languages are usually learned speaking and listening. Second languages are often taught reading and writing before you even know the language. You have to try to memorize all the words. It takes several years to learn to read and write in a second language. A first language, when you're learning a second language, just speaking and listening, with a good teacher, you can learn quite a bit in the first 6 months, and you can be pretty good with it within a year. I was taught to speak and listen and read and write in Spanish in my high school, and I wasn't proficient, but I was very good at the end of 3 years of high school. I did go 4 years. We didn't have Spanish for. Okay. Are younger children more effective language learners than older children? Now, this is a very common belief. Well, kids will just pick up language better than adults. The reason they do this is because, not because they're better learners, but because they are more flexible and they're not intimidated. There's a thing called the affective filter, and I'm not going to give that to you right now. I may have given it to you in a PowerPoint, but emotionally, older people are afraid to make mistakes, and therefore they don't listen very well, and they definitely don't want to produce language where they make a mistake. Kids aren't afraid of mistakes. They make them all the time. Being a kid is making a mistake. Older learners will actually study better and try very hard to do a good job and be efficient, but a lot of times in terms of speaking, they're all afraid to speak openly or to embarrass themselves. And kids are not afraid of speaking out loud. Yeah, they're shy at times, but they're much more willing to take chances. Some of us, I think I'm a pretty good second or third language learner because I don't mind making mistakes. But some people just won't do it. And I've seen adults that I compared them learning to speak a second language, trying to teach a very religious person how to cuss. They just refuse to do it. It's just too difficult. Okay. Big mistake on the third one here. Just because someone seems to speak and listen pretty well and understand in a second language, that means they'll probably do fine in school. Wrong. Because speaking a language in a conversation is totally different from reading and writing. Here's my proof. If everybody that spoke and could listen and was conversational in English, including us first language learners, we're all really good at it, then this would assume that we're all good writers. And that's not true. Otherwise, most people have difficulty writing an essay or even just writing a letter unless they're taught how to read and write. Reading and learning a second language, reading and writing, requires academic instruction, just like the first language. There are a lot of people I know that when you tell them to write a paper or something, it's the worst thing in the world for them. They just want to talk out the paper, but they can't write it. Number 4 myth, and this is where we're getting a lot of misstatements, misconceptions. Learning academic English is equally challenging for all second language learners. No, it's very different depending on a lot of other factors. Now think about it. What would be the other factors? Education. You cannot, learning academic, how to read and write in English, if you don't have that ability in your first language, learning it in the second language is going to be tough because you've never mastered the skill. If you know how to read, I don't care if it's in Arabic or German or Spanish or French, and you go into reading, if you know how to read in that language, then the concept of reading, even if you're reading in Arabic right to left or left to right in English, you know what the concept of reading is, looking at print, decoding, and pronouncing the words. If you've done that, you're in good shape. But a lot of kids we get in English as second language in our schools may never have been in school. It's a whole different world to explain to you the different educational systems in Latin America or in other parts of the world. I can tell you that I used to never worry about students if they came from a place called British Honduras, or what is now called Belize, because it was British Honduras. They had the British educational system there. And students from British Honduras, if they had a good education, if they had a good education, they could do, I always say to people, bother me, I'm trying to talk. If they had a good education, they could read and write fine in English. Okay. So it makes a big difference there. Okay. Now, it also matters what was their other language. If they speak, some languages are very difficult to go from to English. And you got to think about, do they share some of the same sounds? German into English, there are a lot of similarities between German and English. The differences are that German has a different sentence structure. I believe they have the verb at the end, and so the sentence is different. You know, the verb comes at the end of the sentence, and the sentences can be pretty long. We tend to have rather small, short sentences in English. In some languages, they even have shorter sentences. So the written aspect can vary. If we focus on teaching English as a second, here's a 5th one. If we focus on teaching English as a second language, learning in all areas will occur faster. Well, here's the problem. Learning is a developmental process. Learning a language is especially so. You can learn a second language. You can't learn a second language, and it will not occur in the absence of exposure to that language. Increased exposure, particularly in academic, does not guarantee quicker learning. What does this mean? You can't grant, you have to deal with the students where they are. If you have a student who academically is struggling in your 7th grade geography class, then you have to do things like adapt the teaching. You have to pre-teach them the vocabulary. You may have to have a tutor or somebody help them. Make sure they understand the vocabulary, and maybe even give them a few basic phrases so that they're able to either talk about it in class or they can recognize those sentences. Students vary on their ability to pick up stuff. I mean, that's just varies from student to student. So you cannot assume that academic progress will be consistent across different students. It won't be. They're not machines. They're just as different as if we got a group of students out and I decided I was going to have them run a 40-yard dash or something, or the 1 kilometer run, they're going to be slower, faster. They're going to be efficient runners, slow, runners that struggle. You may have to build them up to it. So if I'm using that metaphor, I think that might be fairly effective there. Now, a sixth one, students from Asian countries are better language learners and more academically successful than students from Spanish-speaking backgrounds. That is a stereotype, and I don't like stereotypes. And here's what a stereotype is. When someone says a certain group is better at math than others, or a certain group is better at conversational English than others, they may have observed that in a group. And it may even in some ways be a generalization that's true, but you can't specify and say, oh, I think all students from country X are all really good at math or really good at picking up and writing English essays. That all or nothing or typical, or the thing I like to tell people avoid is common sense, because too often common sense is full of bias. People say, oh, I'm sure that since they're academically very, very good students in such and such a country, and they come over here, that they'll do very well in our classes. There's so many factors that impact that. They may, some countries, they're very good at written and writing and reading in English, but they never speak it because their classes in that country do not emphasize conversational English. So they'll have trouble understanding conversational English. They'll be better at reading if you put your entire lesson online and it was a document, they could go through with a dictionary and read it and figure it out and then write a response to it. But in a face-to-face class, they would not be successful. So just avoid trying to attach anything to it. Certainly the way people communicate, the conversational style of that country may seem similar to English, and that may benefit some students, but don't ever assume that because they seem academically more backward or more advanced, that somehow that means they'll be successful in your class. And frankly, what you have to do is you have to constantly check to see if they understand. And don't ask them, shake your head yes if you understand me, because you'll always get a yes. Students don't want to embarrass the professor, because in many cultures, telling someone you don't understand is a direct insult to the professor. Those are cultural elements. The same in some countries, you're not allowed to speak out loud. You're not allowed to, in class, you don't, or I used to have students that when they would talk in class, Americans were in the same class many years ago. They were, I think, from Pakistan or someplace. And when they would talk to me, they would immediately stand at attention and talk to me as a sign of respect. I tried to get the American students to do the same thing, and they didn't follow along. But that was not our nature. But these students were so accustomed to that they felt very guilty if they did not stand up to show respect. I personally thought it was great. Anytime you get more respect, you eat it up, Now, placement myths. I'm not covering all the myths there are. I could make up more and more and more. I could probably make up 100. But the reason I want you to read these in the book, and I'm not particularly interested, other than you do a little reading, a paragraph or two after each of these dark print areas where it has the myth, as it calls it, myth. Some of the information on numbers of students in the country, I think I skipped over that actually. Demographic myths. In fact, I'm going to go back to that because the number, chapter 1, the number of students who don't speak English is going down. Actually, it could, but it's not. Why is that? Because many people keep their first language. Back in the 1980, when I got my degree, or the 80s, a lot of people thought, well, you got a degree working with ESL, you're probably going to have to leave the country. I mean, who needs to learn English in the United States? Well, it turns out a heck of a lot of people, including native speakers, by the way, um, because it's also reading and writing, and we know reading and writing is not proficient. These numbers are from the 90s in here, so I'm not particularly interested in memorize them. I don't care about that. But you can look up numbers now, and you can find the same factors going on. We are a country that people still try to get in, despite the fact there's all kinds of blockages, walls, or whatever you want to call it, keeping them out. Plus, a vibrant economic country that has growth is attractive. You don't want to be in a country where everybody wants to leave, and there are plenty of those in the world. Okay, another myth about the most limited English proficient, and I call them ESL students, are born outside the United States and are mostly recent arrivals. That's not true. There are many people that are born in the United States. Now, their English speaking and listening may be pretty good because they learn playground English and they watch cartoons like SpongeBob and stuff. But their parents spoke to them in their first language. And they may actually have a mixture of English and whatever that language is. Some people say Spanglish, but it could be anything, a mixture of, you get mixtures of French and English, you get mixtures of, and so people use a French word in there. You say, where's French come from? I had mentioned it. In Maine, people in Canada speak French. And they do study English, but they may be first language French speakers. So the idea that people are outsiders who don't speak English is not necessarily true at all. But you do get the complication of people that do not read or write very well in English. They have conversational English and they get by with that. But when it comes to academics in school, they can't write in English. Okay, another misnomer or a misstatement. Students who do not speak English are found only in urban areas. Now, if you're from central Nebraska, you know this is not true. They're found wherever there are jobs. And those jobs, what are those jobs? Agriculture. Agriculture is not in urban areas. Agriculture is in areas where they have truck farms, where they grow a lot of vegetables, and there's a lot of intense labor to harvest it. Apple harvesting, digging up potatoes, processing potatoes. We have that in Nebraska out west. I think up north in O'Neill. Hothouse gardens, where they have a big hothouse garden. I think they have that in O'Neill. Slaughter plants for sure, because who wants to cut open cows all day and rip their guts out? Okay. We don't have a class in UNK to teach that, because that's not something people want to generally do. But who does the hard work? Who does the jobs that don't pay as much for the most part, or are extremely difficult jobs? Same thing happened, if you ever want to ask this question, who were the people that were miners who went in the mines? Germans from Germany would come over and work the mines. So did people from Wales and some of the Irish and other groups from different parts of Europe. Northern Italy, a lot of Italians where I lived at worked in the mines, over the coal mines, because in their country they knew about mining and they knew how to mine. So jobs like that attracted people. So you're going to find any type there, agriculture, all the way Western United States, you're going to find lots of ESL English learners. Only teachers in urban areas can expect to teach English learners. Well, that's number 4 on here on page 3. And you know that's not true. ESL teachers are needed everywhere. Okay, now I want to go back to placement myths, because I had to go back to chapter 1. Placement myths. Where do you put them in the program in school? Second language learners just need to be placed in an English environment and they'll figure it out. This is called learning English by immersion, or teaching swimming by throwing children into a pond until they survive. You lose a lot of kids. We don't do that. We don't teach swimming by throwing kids in a pond. I know that farmers used to joke about that, but you drown people when you throw them in water. They don't know how to swim. You wouldn't want to eat someone's cooking. They say, go in there and start cooking. You don't want to eat that. They may not cook the chicken through. You may get food poisoning. Food wouldn't be salted or too salted, etc. It has to be done in an organized fashion. English learning is not a matter of exposure. It's not like getting a tan. You have to put them into situations where they can be successful. They call that immersion, by the way, or I call it drowning. I've seen people succeed in it, but for the most part, they were already very advanced academically, and they worked very hard. And yes, they can tell you the story, but it doesn't work for most people. No more than you can teach someone reading by throwing them in a room full of books, and somehow it'll just happen. Second one on placement. English learners' academic success is determined primarily by their ability in English. Well, they obviously have to learn English to be successful academically in English. But the acquisition of English alone doesn't mean they'll be successful. They may learn to speak and listen and converse in elementary school, but they may not learn to read. Reading is its own structure. That's why we have reading teachers. We know that even English learners do not learn to read unless they're properly taught how to read. And I want to add that means making it a positive experience. There's plenty of you out there I talk to in education that have found that you actually hate to read. I have a kid that hates to read. Never found it was never exciting, never pleasant. Can you imagine if you had to be a painter, not necessarily an artist, but you had to paint things and you actually hated to paint because you had such a terrible time with it? What a miserable way to make your living, doing something you hate. For me, that would be art because I had no artistic talent, and being in art classes was a disaster. Placement myth number 3 is on page 34. Second language learners need only about 1 year in English to be able to succeed academically. Sorry, academic English takes years to learn properly. And what people do is they try to give them the basics of reading and writing. And I can tell you the key to that is getting them to read and read for pleasure. Because if you read and enjoy reading, you will feed the patterns of English language and the vocabulary and the terms and all that stuff and the phrases and the way things are said well on paper or in reading. And that will help a person be able to write because they'll read Harry Potter and they'll enjoy it. And then when they write about it, they'll be able to tell the story and they'll remember some of the vocabulary and they'll actually reproduce in their own way through paraphrase. They'll reproduce the story. They retell the story. Retelling stories is a big, big strategy for reading. And it's often said that learning academic English takes 5 to 7 years or longer, whereas learning to speak or listen to English, if you have a lot of time with it, takes no more than 2 years or maybe less. And of course, young kids do very well with it. There's no question about that. But also that's because they're less intimidated and they're open. They're more open. They don't hide and avoid being embarrassed. Another misstatement. Until students learn English, there's no point trying to teach them content. Big, big issue here. You have to teach them science and geography and mathematics at the same time that they're learning English. It used to be a disaster that people would keep them in classes saying, you're going to learn English. And once you've learned enough English, we're just going to put you in regular classes. What happened? They didn't learn English fast enough and they got behind. So by the time they're in fifth grade and their English is pretty good, they've already missed 3 years of mathematics instruction. They've missed 3 or 4 years of reading instruction. So what schools do now is they put them in sheltered workshops. That's our book. Sheltered workshop. What does sheltered mean? It means they're learning English, but they're also focusing on content. Okay. These babies just keep coming up. Okay, number 5 placement myth. Students should be placed in programs for students with disabilities, or they use handicapping here. We don't use handicapping. That is horrible. ESL learning or English learners are not special education students. It is not a disability to not speak English. I don't go to France and suddenly become a special education student. Now, here's the issue. There are often English learners who should be in special education. That is a very delicate situation, and it can only be determined by a specialist in special education who happens to also be able to test, usually test by using the language of the student. And if it's Spanish, there are many tests in Spanish, but if it's some unusual language, it may be much tougher to do. Then maybe there's a less academic or language intense test. So that if you go to a school, and this was very common 20 years ago, that people would put ESL kids, English learners, would stick them in special education. And students in special education have to be tested to qualify. And anyone putting someone in there without the proper testing is committing malpractice in SPED and in education. Number 6, when teaching newcomers, it is best to hold off reading and writing until their speaking and listening is good. No, you have to expose kids to reading and writing, even if they're not very into it yet. They should handle books. They should look at books. They should look at print. You do not tell them, as I mentioned a while ago, you do not hold them back for 3 or 4 years so their English is really good and then say, okay, now we're going to let you look at books. We are ready to read at a certain age, and even though it's not as efficient and it's not ideal, you do not delay their exposure to reading and writing. You have to get that in at the proper time. A first grader with limited English, what do you do in that situation? Well, first of all, if you can have their parents read to them in their native language. And it's not hard to get bilingual books. I have some here on the shelves, and I may show those to you this semester. It'd be nice if you just came in. I know some of you are at a distance, but I have videos and I can show you. I have books that are bilingual. I have some that are in Spanish, but I have some that are in English and Spanish, Vietnamese and English, Turkish in English, and so on. I don't read Turkish. I don't read Vietnamese, but the parents could read to them in their native language if they read their own language. And many times in Asian countries, it's usually they're literate. And usually in Central America and Latin America as well. But you want to get kids exposed to books. Don't hold off. Another placement myth. They just keep rolling on here. English learners who speak very little English should be placed with younger students so they can more easily learn English. I've seen this, it gets bizarre. You can have a 16-year-old sitting in a class with 11-year-olds. That is not appropriate, and it's just weird. And so you don't take a 16-year-old and put them in a much younger children's class. It's inappropriate. It can be very embarrassing for the older student. You put them in with a group, their age group. They will also learn, they need to be with roughly their age group because they can socialize. And it also does a lot for their development as human beings. If I went to Germany and they told me my spoken German is very bad, so they put me in second grade and I'm a grown man. That's just weird. Okay, you don't do that. All right. I've seen all these things happen. Weird placement of kids. Placement, myth number 8. This is the last one in this reading for today. It's on page 44. Second language students shouldn't be expected to achieve the same level of fluency as English students, and teachers need to lower their expectations. Okay, big mistake. First of all, anytime you have a student and you have low expectations from them, they'll probably give you the low expectations. When you have high expectations of a student, they tend to do better. I don't say it as an absolute, but if I go in and I say, oh, so-and-so's in my math class, he's a C student. That's about all you can expect. Think of that if that were you in there or your kid in there, and I'm the math teacher, and I said that about your kid. I don't think your kid's got it. Well, guess what? I'm going to grade that way. I'm biased against their ability. I'm biased against them and their potential. You don't know what the potential of students are. So you have to provide a wide, open mind expectation they will be successful. Okay, I just wanted to cover these basically and give voice to what these are. Kind of skipped around in there because I forgot the first chapter, but my point is I want you as people in TESOL to realize that these are serious issues. I may think of a way to check you on this because I want you to be able to respond to these. I'll call it dumb ideas you'll run into in the future and what you have to say when you run into them. This would be a good one for a quiz, okay? But in your discussion, I'm going to follow up on this a little bit. But I'm talking about really getting you ready to be an ESL teacher, and this is the kind of nonsense you'll run into with people. Causes serious issues. So anyhow, I'm going to record this, and this will be your video, and you can respond to me or respond to the readings. And adios.